The Aurora had been traveling toward Earth for 3 weeks when Marcus received an unexpected message. It came from the Celestial Council through Zephyr, the emissary who had first brought Marcus to meet the gods. The message was an invitation to a formal gathering on a neutral world, a place that had been chosen to host the first Universal Assembly. This assembly would bring together representatives from every civilization that had a stake in how the new divine matrix would operate. Captain Lisa encouraged Marcus to attend. She knew that his work was not finished. The new system was functioning, but it would require careful maintenance and continuous improvement. The assembly would be a place where Marcus could share his knowledge with others and help establish the standards that would guide the divine matrix's operation for centuries to come. Marcus packed his belongings and traveled with Sarah, Kevin, and Angela to the assembly site. The planet chosen for the gathering was called Harmonia, and it was one of the most beautiful worlds in the known galaxy. Tall crystal mountains stretched toward blue skies. Vast forests of silver trees grew in valleys where water flowed like liquid light. The atmosphere was breathable for most carbon-based life forms, making it ideal as a neutral meeting place. The assembly building was constructed to accommodate beings of every size and physiology. There were chambers filled with water for aquatic species, gardens of nutrient-rich soil for plant-based life forms, and energy chambers where beings of pure consciousness could exist comfortably. The main conference hall was vast enough to hold thousands of delegates, yet designed with perfect acoustics so that every word could be heard clearly. When Marcus entered the main hall for the first time, he was overwhelmed by the diversity of life present. There were crystalline beings like the Vorthan. There were insectoid species with compound eyes and chitinous bodies. There were beings that appeared as swirling clouds of intelligent gas. There were creatures made of living rock and stone. There were representatives from Earth's human government as well, including officials from the United Nations and various space agencies. The assembly began with opening remarks from the Celestial Council. Each of the 12 gods spoke about their commitment to the new system and their willingness to accept oversight and shared governance. Their words were carefully chosen and formal, but Marcus could sense the underlying discomfort. These beings had ruled alone for eons, and accepting equals was a painful transition for them. Then, Marcus was called upon to explain the technical structure of the new divine matrix. He stood before thousands of beings and began explaining in simple language how the new system would function. He talked about redundancy and backup protocols. He explained the importance of distributed control and how different administrators would manage different aspects of reality. He described the audit procedures that would ensure transparency and prevent corruption. As Marcus spoke, he noticed something remarkable happening. The various species in the audience were listening carefully, taking notes, asking thoughtful questions. They were genuinely interested in understanding how the universe's fundamental systems worked. Many of them had suffered under the old system's failures. Now they wanted to contribute to making sure that such failures would never happen again. During a break, representatives from Earth approached Marcus. They included diplomats, scientists, and military leaders. They thanked him for his service to humanity and to the galaxy. One diplomat, named Jackson, explained that Earth's government wanted to establish a formal department dedicated to cosmic systems maintenance. They wanted to train the brightest minds on Earth to become certified IT specialists for the divine matrix. Humans have always been good at fixing things, Jackson said with a smile. We turn broken problems into opportunities. It seems like the universe could use more of that attitude. Marcus agreed and promised to help develop training programs. He knew that humans had a unique perspective on problem solving. Their capacity to improvise, to think creatively when traditional solutions failed, and to cooperate with diverse groups would make them excellent administrators for the new system. Over the following days, the assembly worked on establishing protocols and regulations for the divine matrix's operation. Marcus served on the technical committee that wrote the specifications for how the system would be maintained. He worked with specialists from dozens of civilizations, sharing knowledge and learning their perspectives. One interesting discovery came from a brilliant Canary engineer named Zethel. The Canary were ancient traders who had traveled the galaxy for millions of years and accumulated vast technological knowledge. Zethel proposed that the divine matrix should include what he called an eternal learning system. This system would constantly analyze the performance of reality's fundamental forces and suggest improvements. It would identify inefficiencies and propose solutions. The system would never make changes without approval from the assembly, but it would ensure that continuous improvement was always happening. Marcus loved this idea. It meant that the universe would not stagnate. It meant that reality itself could evolve and improve over time. He worked with Zethel to implement this concept into the new divine matrix's architecture. Another proposal came from an aquatic species called the Thelosians. They suggested that the divine matrix should maintain what they called diverse reality zones. These zones would be regions of space where different physical laws could be tested in controlled environments. Scientists from various civilizations could propose experiments, and if approved by the assembly, they could test new possibilities within these zones. This would allow the universe to innovate while keeping the primary reality stable. As the assembly progressed, Marcus began to see a new kind of governance emerging. It was not perfect. There were debates and disagreements. Some species wanted more control over their local systems. Others wanted stronger global oversight. Some beings feared that collaboration would slow down progress. Others worried that innovation might destabilize reality. But through these discussions, a new philosophy was developing. It was based on the understanding that the universe was not a fixed thing to be controlled by a few powerful beings. Instead, it was a living system that could be improved through cooperation, transparency, and continuous learning. The old system had failed because it had been based on the illusion of perfection. The new system was based on the reality of ongoing growth. One evening, Marcus stood on a high platform overlooking Harmonia's crystal mountains. Zephyr appeared beside him, the god's form shimmering in the sunset. For the first time, Zephyr did not radiate an aura of absolute superiority. Instead, the being seemed thoughtful and almost peaceful. "You have changed us," Zephyr said quietly. "The Celestial Council is not the same as it was before. We are learning what it means to be wrong, to accept criticism, to listen to beings we once considered beneath our notice." Marcus nodded. "You were not wrong to want to guide reality. You just forgot that guidance works best when it includes the perspectives of those being guided. The universe is too complex for any group, no matter how powerful, to manage alone." Zephyr looked out at the vast landscape before them. "I wonder what the universe will look like in 1,000 years, the god said. "Will it still be stable? Will the new system work, or will new problems emerge?" "There will always be problems," Marcus replied. "That is the nature of any complex system. But now, there will be thousands of brilliant minds working together to solve those problems. That is something your old system never had. That is why the new system will be stronger." As the assembly concluded, representatives from every civilization signed the Charter of Shared Governance. It was a historic document that fundamentally changed how the universe would be administered. The Celestial Council still held significant power, but they no longer held absolute power. The divine matrix was now a shared responsibility. Marcus returned to Earth as a celebrated figure, but he did not let the fame go to his head. He understood that the real work was just beginning. He established the Institute for Cosmic Systems Administration in Geneva, Switzerland. The institute would train the next generation of universal technicians, specialists who would keep the divine matrix running smoothly and help implement improvements as the assembly approved them. Young people from Earth and from other worlds began arriving to study at the institute. They learned not just technical skills, but also philosophy, ethics, and the history of the universe's governance. They learned that fixing complex systems required not just technical knowledge, but also wisdom, patience, and the ability to listen to others. Marcus often taught the first class, which he called Introduction to Systems Thinking. In his lectures, he would tell students about the day he discovered the malware in the divine matrix. He would explain how he had learned that even the most powerful beings in the universe could have blind spots. He would emphasize that true expertise came not from arrogance, but from the humility to admit when you did not know something, and the willingness to keep learning throughout your life. The universe, it seemed, had discovered something precious. It had learned that cooperation was stronger than control, that transparency was more powerful than secrecy, and that the future could be built by working. The day of the shutdown arrived. It was the most important moment in the history of the known universe. All across the galaxy, civilizations were informed that the divine matrix would be going offline for an indefinite period. They were told to prepare for manual control of their own planetary systems. The gods who had guided reality for billions of years would be stepping back. and lesser beings would have to manage on their own. Many civilizations panicked. They had relied on the divine matrix's control for so long that they had forgotten how to operate independently. Some species began preparing for chaos and war. Others started religious rituals, believing that the end of the universe was coming. But there were also civilizations that saw an opportunity. For the first time in recorded history, they would be free to make their own choices without divine intervention. Marcus and his team worked around the clock preparing for the shutdown. They had to install the fail-safes that would keep planets stable and stars burning without the divine matrix's constant adjustments. They had to create protocols that would allow individual civilizations to manage their own physics and planetary systems. It was incredibly complex work, and there was no room for error. As the countdown reached its final hours, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was about to shut down the system that maintained the laws of physics for trillions of beings. If anything went wrong, the results would be catastrophic. But he also knew that this was necessary. The universe could not continue functioning with a system that was infected and degrading. Sarah approached Marcus in the control center. She had been working for 40 hours straight without sleep. "All the fail-safes are in place," she reported. "The planetary stabilization protocols are ready. The failover systems are functioning. We are ready to proceed." Kevin and Angela confirmed that their sections were also prepared. Marcus took a deep breath and placed his hand on the shutdown control. The Celestial Council watched from their chamber, unable to do anything but observe as lesser beings took control of their creation. For the first time in their existence, the gods felt something close to fear. Marcus activated the shutdown sequence. The divine matrix, which had controlled reality for eons, began powering down. Across the galaxy, the constant influence of divine will ceased. Stars continued to burn because of the fail-safes. Planets remained in their orbits because of the stabilization protocols. But for the first time in history, reality began operating on its own, without gods guiding every moment. What happened next was unexpected and beautiful. Instead of chaos erupting, civilizations began to work together. Without the divine matrix controlling events, species that had been kept separate by divine will found themselves able to interact freely. Communities that had been controlled by the gods began organizing themselves. Beings who had been told what to do by divine authority began making their own choices. On Earth, humans noticed that their technology was working differently. The constant divine adjustments that had kept their world stable were gone. But humans adapted quickly. They had always been clever at solving problems. Communities began sharing knowledge and resources to keep their world functioning. It was not perfect, but it was stable. And more importantly, it was free. The Aurora's crew monitored reports from across the galaxy. Instead of the collapse everyone had feared, they saw something remarkable. Civilizations were cooperating. Species that had never communicated before were sharing technology and knowledge. The removal of divine control had not led to chaos. It had led to cooperation born from necessity and genuine understanding between different peoples. Meanwhile, Marcus and his team began the real work. They had to completely rebuild the divine matrix from scratch. They had to write new code, implement new security protocols, and create a system that was not only technically superior to what the gods had created, but also fundamentally different in its approach. Marcus decided that the new system should not concentrate all power in the hands of the Celestial Council. Instead, he proposed a distributed architecture where different aspects of reality would be controlled by different administrators. There would be checks and balances. There would be oversight from external parties. No single being or group would have absolute power anymore. The Celestial Council objected to this proposal. They were not accustomed to sharing power or accepting oversight. But Marcus reminded them that the old system, built on total power and absolute control, was what had allowed the malware to flourish. If they wanted a system that would be secure and stable, they would have to accept limitations on their authority. The debate raged for days. Some members of the council refused to accept Marcus's proposal. They wanted to rebuild the old system with only minor improvements. They argued that sharing power was beneath them and that lesser beings could not be trusted with responsibility. But other council members were beginning to see the wisdom in Marcus's approach. The being made of silver, who seemed to be the most reasonable of the gods, supported the proposal strongly. After intense negotiation, the Celestial Council agreed to Marcus's plan. The new divine matrix would be a collaborative system. The gods would retain significant power, but they would not have absolute control. Representatives from major civilizations would have a say in how the system operated. There would be regular audits and reviews. The system would be designed to be updated and improved over time, rather than remaining static forever. Marcus, Sarah, Kevin, and Angela worked with specialists from dozens of alien civilizations to implement the new system. It took weeks of intensive labor. They had to write millions of lines of code. They had to test every function to ensure nothing would break. They had to install redundancies and backup systems that the old divine matrix had never possessed. Finally, the day arrived to bring the new divine matrix online. Marcus sat at the primary control station, his hand hovering over the activation button. Around him, beings from 100 different species watched and waited. The Celestial Council was present, their divine power held in check so that lesser beings could participate in this historic moment. Marcus activated the new system. The divine matrix came online and the universe gasped. Reality shifted into its new configuration. But this time, it was not the shifting of absolute divine control. It was the reawakening of a system designed by cooperation and consensus. Physics resumed its normal operation, but it did so under a new framework of shared governance. Across the galaxy, celebrations erupted. Civilizations that had been living in fear of divine intervention discovered that the universe was still functioning, but now they had a voice in how it operated. The most remarkable change came from the Celestial Council themselves. For the first time in their existence, they were not alone in controlling reality, and instead of feeling diminished, many of them felt liberated from the burden of absolute responsibility. Marcus was recognized as the savior of the universe. He received formal honors from hundreds of civilizations. But Marcus knew that the real victory was not his alone. It belonged to his team, to the alien specialists who had contributed their knowledge, and even to the Celestial Council members who had been willing to accept change. When Marcus finally returned to the Aurora, Captain Lisa welcomed him back with a smile. "So," she said warmly, "you went out to fix a broken computer system and ended up changing the governance structure of the entire universe." Marcus laughed and sat down in the command chair. "It is all just systems administration," he replied. "The scale was larger than usual, but the principles are the same. Find the problem, communicate clearly about what needs to change, and work with the people involved to implement the solution." The Aurora set course for home, back to Earth. But the universe itself had been fundamentally transformed. Reality now operated not through divine mandate, but through cooperation and shared responsibility. Beings of all species could contribute ideas and improvements. The universe had learned that true power came not from absolute control, but from the ability to accept help and work together toward common goals. And in the training centers that began appearing on every major world, a new profession was being established. Beings learned how to maintain the divine matrix, how to troubleshoot problems, and how to improve systems through continuous innovation. They called themselves IT specialists, and they understood that keeping the universe running smoothly would require constant attention, regular updates, and most importantly, a willingness to accept that nothing was perfect and everything could always be improved. The gods had learned humility, and the universe would never be the same. Marcus was transported back to the Aurora, with the authority of the Celestial Council backing him. This changed everything. Captain Lisa immediately authorized him to assemble a team of the best technical specialists from the ship. He selected Sarah, a brilliant network engineer who had worked with Marcus for 8 years. He chose Kevin, a systems architect who had designed several advanced networks for Earth-based organizations. He also brought Angela, a security specialist who had made her career understanding how malware worked and how to stop it. The 4 of them were transported to a massive facility orbiting the neutron star. This facility was built specifically to maintain the divine matrix and handle its operations. It contained thousands of workstations, all connected to the central system. When Marcus and his team entered, they felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what they were seeing. The divine matrix was not just a computer network. It was a living system, constantly running millions of processes that kept reality functioning. Marcus assigned each team member a different area to investigate. Sarah began mapping the network architecture, trying to understand how it was organized and where the data flows were moving. Kevin dove into the system's core design, trying to understand the fundamental principles on which everything was built. Angela started running diagnostics to find the malware's location and understand its structure. Marcus himself began examining the system logs, looking for any clues about where the infection had started and how long it had been spreading. What they discovered troubled them deeply. The system had been built eons ago using principles that were outdated and fundamentally flawed. There were no redundancies. There were no safeguards. There was no way to roll back changes if something went wrong. The entire system had been designed around the assumption that the gods who controlled it would never make mistakes and that no external threat could ever compromise. Sarah found evidence of multiple attempts to patch the system over the years, but these patches had been done poorly. They had added layers of code on top of the original architecture instead of fixing the underlying problems. This created a bloated, inefficient system that was vulnerable at multiple points. She reported to Marcus that the system was like a building that had been patched repeatedly without ever fixing its foundation. Eventually, it would collapse under its own weight. Kevin's analysis was even more concerning. He discovered that the gods had been manually overriding safety protocols for their own personal projects. Some of the council members had used the divine matrix to manipulate events in specific galaxies. Others had accessed the system's code directly to experiment with new laws of physics. These manual interventions had created security holes that a sophisticated attacker could exploit. Kevin estimated that there were at least 50 places where an unauthorized user could gain access to the system if they knew what to look for. Angela's findings were the most alarming. The malware she discovered was unlike anything any of them had ever encountered. It was not a traditional virus or worm. Instead, it was a self-replicating program that fed on specific patterns of data. Those patterns corresponded exactly to what the system generated when it encountered denial, obstinacy, and refusal to accept criticism. The more the Celestial Council denied that there was a problem, the more the malware grew. "This is not random," Angela said as she showed Marcus her analysis. "Someone designed this malware specifically to attack systems like the Divine Matrix. Someone who understood that the greatest vulnerability of the gods was their own pride and refusal to accept that they could make mistakes." Marcus called the team together to discuss their findings. They sat in the break room of the maintenance facility, drinking terrible coffee that the facility's systems had produced, and talked about what they had learned. None of them wanted to say it out loud, but they all understood the implication of Angela's discovery. "You think the malware came from inside the system?" Sarah said quietly. "You think it was created by the Divine Matrix itself?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Or it was created by someone with profound knowledge of how the system works and how the gods think. But either way, the infection is feeding on behavior patterns that the gods generate naturally. The more they refuse to accept help, the stronger it becomes." Kevin added his own observation. "The system was never designed to be fixed by external help. The architecture assumes that everything comes from within the council. When you try to remove the malware, the system interprets it as an attack and begins generating defensive code that makes the malware even stronger. This presented a serious problem. They could not simply delete the malware because the system would interpret deletion attempts as attacks and reinforce the infection. They needed a different approach. They needed to trick the system into accepting the repairs as legitimate changes made by the gods themselves. Marcus spent the next several days working on a solution. He studied the Divine Matrix's code until he understood how it validated changes and commands. He discovered that the system had authentication protocols that allowed gods to make modifications without any oversight. It trusted their instructions implicitly. This was the vulnerability they needed to exploit. Marcus and his team began forging commands that appeared to come from the Celestial Council. They created patches disguised as divine updates. They made the malware removal look like a legitimate maintenance task authorized by the gods themselves. It was delicate work and there was no room for error. If the system detected the forgery, the malware would multiply exponentially, and the entire network might crash. But there was another problem. Even if they could remove the malware, they could not rebuild the system using the current architecture. It was fundamentally broken. They needed to convince the council to allow a complete system redesign, something that would require the gods to admit that their creation had been poorly designed from the beginning. Marcus requested a meeting with the Celestial Council. When he appeared before them again, the beings seemed less hostile than before, possibly because they had had time to accept the reality of the situation. Marcus explained what his team had discovered and what they needed to do to fix the problem. "Your system cannot be repaired with patches," Marcus said plainly. "It must be rebuilt from the ground up. But such a rebuilding is not something my team and I can do alone. We need your cooperation. We need you to admit that the system was flawed when you designed it. We need you to accept responsibility for not maintaining it properly. And we need you to grant us authority to make changes that you might not have approved before." The council fell silent. For beings accustomed to absolute power and authority, admitting failure was almost impossible. But they also understood that the alternative was the collapse of reality itself. The being made of silver spoke first. "If we do this thing, if we allow you to rebuild our system, we will be admitting that we are not perfect. We will be surrendering the control that we have maintained for billions of years. This is a difficult choice for us." Marcus waited. He did not push or argue. He simply waited for the council to come to terms with the truth. Finally, one by one, the members of the Celestial Council agreed. They would shut down the divine matrix completely. They would allow Marcus and his team to rebuild it using new architecture. During the shutdown, reality would not collapse because of the failsafes that Marcus and his team had quietly installed. But all civilizations would need to manage without the divine matrix's control for a period of time. Everything would have to be done manually. Physics would operate on its own without divine guidance. It was a monumental decision, and it would change everything. But it was the only way to save the universe from the malware that fed on divine ego. Marcus understood that the real work was just beginning. He and his team would need to rebuild the system while keeping reality stable. And they would need to do it before the remaining malware spread too far. Zephyr's ship moved through space faster than light, using technology that Marcus could barely comprehend. Inside the vessel, Marcus was given a viewing window that showed the cosmos stretching out before them in impossible ways. The ship seemed to exist partially outside normal space and time, which meant they could travel across the galaxy in what felt like only minutes. During the journey, Zephyr tried to prepare Marcus for what he would encounter with the Celestial Council. The emissary explained that the council consisted of 12 beings, each of whom had existed for billions of years. They had created the divine matrix together, and they had used it to shape the development of countless civilizations. They were accustomed to absolute obedience and never questioned. They viewed lesser beings not as equals but as creations to be managed. Marcus listened carefully but did not feel intimidated. He had dealt with difficult clients before. He had worked with corporate executives who refused to understand technical concepts. He had managed systems administrators who thought they knew everything but actually knew very little. He believed that if he could explain the problem clearly and offer a solution, even gods would listen to reason. The ship descended toward a massive structure that orbited a neutron star. The structure was beyond massive. It was a sphere that was the size of a planet, made from materials that seemed to shift between solid and energy. This was the Celestial Throne, the home of the Celestial Council. As Zephyr's ship docked, Marcus felt a wave of power wash over him. It was not painful, but it was overwhelming, like standing in front of the loudest speaker ever created while music played at impossible volumes. Zephyr guided Marcus through corridors that seemed to extend infinitely. They passed through chambers where reality itself seemed to be negotiated. In one room, Marcus saw what looked like equations made from living light, calculations that were controlling the fundamental forces of the universe. In another room, Marcus saw beings of pure consciousness moving through layers of existence that his eyes could barely perceive. Finally, they arrived at the council chamber. It was a vast circular room with 12 thrones arranged in a circle. Seated upon these thrones were the members of the Celestial Council. They were the most beautiful and most terrible beings Marcus had ever seen. Some appeared almost humanoid. Others seemed to be made of galaxies or living mathematics. One being appeared to be a living storm of pure energy. Another looked like an ancient tree that grew upward through all of existence. The council turned their attention to Marcus, and he felt the weight of their combined consciousness focus upon him like spotlights. It was difficult to breathe, difficult to think, difficult to remember that he was just a human IT specialist with a job to do. But Marcus forced himself to focus. He had rehearsed what he needed to say. He had his data. He had his analysis. He knew what needed to happen. A voice that sounded like the birth of stars spoke to him. We are the Celestial Council. Zephyr tells us that you have discovered a flaw in the divine matrix. This seems unlikely as our creation is perfect. We have maintained it flawlessly for eons. Therefore, you must have made an error in your analysis. Marcus took a deep breath. This was the moment that would determine everything. He could bow and retreat, accepting the Council's superiority. Or he could speak the truth as he understood it. With respect, I have not made an error, Marcus said, his voice steady and clear. Your system is not perfect. It is infected with malware that is spreading rapidly. The malware appears to be self-replicating and feeding on something that your system is producing. The more the system denies that there is a problem, the worse the infection becomes. A different voice, one that sounded like crystalline bells breaking, spoke. You dare speak to us as if we were equals? You dare tell us that our creation is flawed? Marcus did not flinch. I am speaking as a technical specialist to beings who need technical assistance. The problem is simple to understand. Your system has no security protocols. There are no firewalls. There are no diagnostic tools running in the background. There are no backup systems. You have built something incredibly powerful, but you have built it like someone who believes that nothing bad will ever happen. That belief was your vulnerability. The council began to argue among themselves. Some of the beings were defensive and angry. Others seemed curious and willing to listen. One being, who appeared to be made of living silver, spoke more calmly than the others. If what you say is true, what would you propose we do about it? Marcus pulled up his portable computer and projected his findings into the air using a holographic display. He showed them the structure of the malware, explained how it worked, and demonstrated how it was spreading. He explained that the infection was not random. It was deliberately targeting the core systems that maintained the laws of physics and probability. The malware appears to be attracted to ego and denial, Marcus explained. The more you deny the problem, the more it spreads. This suggests it was either created by someone who knows your system very well, or it emerged from the system itself as a result of the way it was designed. The being made of silver leaned forward with great interest. What do you know of this malware's origin? Marcus shook his head slowly. I need access to your complete system logs and core architecture. I need to see how the system actually functions and where the infection began. Until I have that information, I cannot tell you where it came from. But I can tell you that if we do not act quickly, your entire system will collapse. And if this system is what maintains the laws of physics across known space, then the collapse will affect everything, and everyone. The implications of Marcus's words hung in the air. The council understood that they had a choice. They could reject Marcus and continue to deny the problem, which would guarantee failure. Or they could accept help from a lesser being and risk their pride. It was not an easy choice for creatures who had never questioned their own superiority. After what felt like an eternity, the council reached a decision. They would grant Marcus access to the divine matrix. They would allow him to begin repairs and analysis. However, they made it clear that if Marcus failed or if he attempted to use the system's secrets for his own purposes, there would be consequences beyond his ability to imagine. Marcus accepted these terms without hesitation. He knew the responsibility he had just taken on. He was now responsible for fixing the system that maintained the laws of physics for the entire galaxy. It was perhaps the most important job anyone had ever been given. And he had only a limited amount of time to succeed before the entire system crashed and took reality itself down with it. Marcus and his team returned to the Aurora with all the data they had collected from the derelict station. Captain Lisa immediately sent out a priority distress call to the Interstellar Coalition, the alliance of advanced alien species that governed most of known space. She described what they had found and asked for assistance in understanding the nature of the crisis affecting the mysterious network. The response came faster than anyone expected. Within hours, several powerful alien civilizations had sent representatives to meet with the Aurora. Beings arrived in sleek, advanced spacecraft that dwarfed humanity's research vessel. There were the Vorthon, tall crystalline creatures made of living glass. There were the Zalketh, intelligent energy beings that existed partially outside normal space. There were representatives from the Canary species, wise merchants who had traveled the galaxy for millions of years. All of them had received the same mysterious emergency alert that Marcus had discovered on the station. The distress signal was not new. It had been broadcasting for weeks, but most civilizations had dismissed it as an old artifact or technical malfunction of little importance. However, when Captain Lisa provided them with Marcus's analysis, everything changed. The data Marcus had collected revealed that this ancient network was not defunct or irrelevant. It was actively failing, and its failure was causing strange phenomena throughout the galaxy. Reports came flooding in from dozens of worlds. Planets were experiencing unusual gravitational fluctuations. Star systems were reporting probability anomalies where the laws of physics seemed to be operating incorrectly. Some civilizations reported that their own technological systems were beginning to malfunction for no apparent reason. The symptoms were subtle but widespread, affecting everything from minor colony settlements to the most advanced technological hubs in known space. Marcus was asked to present his findings to the assembled representatives. He stood before beings of incredible power and intelligence, some of whom had lived for millions of years. He was nervous, but he had learned in his career that technical truth was the same regardless of who was listening. He explained what the data had shown him. The ancient network, which he now believed to be some kind of universal computational system, was infected with corrupted code. The malware was spreading, causing cascading failures throughout the network's operations. The alien representatives listened with growing concern. They asked Marcus detailed questions about the nature of the infection, what could have caused it, and whether it could be stopped. Marcus answered honestly that he needed more time to fully analyze the system, but based on what he could see, whoever designed this network had not built in sufficient security protections. The system was vulnerable to attack, and something had definitely exploited those vulnerabilities. While Marcus was presenting his findings to the coalition, something extraordinary happened in a distant part of the galaxy. The Celestial Council, a group of ancient godlike beings who had existed since before most of the current civilizations were born, became aware that their system was failing. The Divine Matrix, as they called it, was the computational network that actually controlled the laws of physics and probability throughout known space. For eons, they had maintained absolute control over it, never allowing any external oversight or interference. The Celestial Council was not pleased to learn that a human IT specialist had discovered their system was compromised. They also learned that the information had been shared with the Interstellar Coalition, which meant dozens of lesser species now knew about their network. To the gods, this was a catastrophe of ego and pride far worse than any technical failure. They could not accept that beings they considered beneath them had found problems in their supposedly perfect system. The council sent an emissary named Zephyr to investigate and manage the situation. Zephyr was beautiful in a way that transcended normal description. When the being appeared aboard the Aurora, the light in the room seemed to bend around their presence. Zephyr had features that were both masculine and feminine, wearing robes that appeared to be woven from starlight itself. The emissary possessed power that could reshape reality, and had been a member of the Celestial Council for 3 billion years. Captain Lisa greeted Zephyr with the respect due to such a powerful being. She invited the emissary to meet with Marcus, who was still analyzing the data in the computer room. Lisa had warned Marcus that Zephyr was a being of immense importance, and he should show appropriate respect and deference. Marcus was working on his analysis when Zephyr entered his office. Marcus looked up from his screens, saw the magnificent being before him, and immediately thought that the office had become much too warm. But he did not stand up. He did not bow. Instead, Marcus squinted slightly at Zephyr and asked, "Are you the system administrator, or do you know who is? I need to speak with whoever designed the Divine Matrix because we have a serious problem that needs discussing." Zephyr was not accustomed to being spoken to in such a casual manner. The emissary expected to be treated with the reverence that a god should receive. Instead, this human had treated him like any other person who might call a help desk with a technical problem. Zephyr felt a wave of anger and indignation rise within their perfect heart. However, the emissary was also curious. Never in their vast existence had a lesser being failed to recognize their divine nature. "I am Zephyr, member of the Celestial Council," the being announced grandly. "I have come to assess your claims about our system. I suspect you have misunderstood what you have found." Marcus turned his monitors toward Zephyr and began explaining the data he had discovered. He spoke as he would speak to any client who was not understanding a technical situation. He drew diagrams on his screen showing how the malware was structured. He explained how the corruption was spreading through the system like a virus through a computer network. He described the cascade failures that would result if the infection was not contained and treated. The more Marcus talked, the more Zephyr listened. Despite their anger at being treated disrespectfully, Zephyr could not deny that this human seemed to understand something about the divine matrix that even the Celestial Council had missed. The Council had been so confident in their own power and perfection that they had not conducted any serious diagnostic of their system in millions of years. "What you are suggesting is impossible," Zephyr said finally. "Our system cannot be compromised. We designed it ourselves and have protected it with power beyond measure." Marcus simply nodded and pointed to his screens again. "That is exactly the problem. The best security comes from regular testing and openness to the possibility that things can go wrong. Your system is failing because nobody has been paying attention to maintenance and defense. Pride and confidence are not the same as actual protection." Zephyr sat silently for a long moment. The emissary knew that bringing this information back to the Council would cause tremendous conflict and embarrassment. However, the evidence was undeniable. Something had to be done, and it was becoming clear that this human might be the only one with the skills and perspective to help fix what the gods had created. Zephyr stood and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. The touch was gentle but carried the weight of divine authority. "Come with me, Marcus. The Celestial Council must hear what you have to say. But be warned, gods do not accept correction easily. You may be walking into a situation far more dangerous than you can imagine." Marcus saved his work and stood up. He had no idea what he was about to face, but he knew his skills would be needed. He followed Zephyr out of the Aurora toward a ship made of materials that did not seem to exist in normal space. As he walked, Marcus thought about how his day had changed from routine maintenance work to something that might affect the entire universe. He had always believed that problems could be solved with logic, hard work, and clear communication. Now he was about to test that belief against the most powerful beings in existence. The research vessel Aurora moved quietly through the darkness of space, its sensors scanning the endless void for signs of life or civilization. Marcus sat in the small computer room near the back of the ship, surrounded by monitors that displayed vast amounts of data streaming in from the ship's equipment. He had always loved this part of his job as an IT specialist. There was something peaceful about being alone with the machines, watching them work in harmony, fixing problems that arose, and keeping everything running smoothly. Marcus was not a military man. Though he worked for a space exploration organization, he was simply a technical expert who had been hired to maintain all the computers and systems aboard the Aurora. He was good at what he did. For 15 years, he had worked in corporate IT departments on Earth, dealing with server crashes, network failures, and frustrated employees. When the opportunity came to work in space, Marcus jumped at it without hesitation. Captain Lisa entered the control room and glanced at Marcus through the glass window of his small office. She was a tall woman with short black hair and the kind of calm demeanor that made others trust her with their lives. Lisa had been commanding the Aurora for 6 years and had never lost a crew member or failed a mission. She noticed Marcus was frowning at his screens. Lisa pressed a button and spoke through the intercom. "Marcus, we are picking up something unusual on the long-range scanners. Can you help us investigate?" Marcus looked up from his work. This kind of request was common. The ship's navigation team often needed his help to interpret sensor data or boost signals that were too weak to read clearly. He saved his work and stood up, stretching his back before making his way to the main control room where Lisa and 3 other crew members were gathered around a large display screen. On the screen was a blinking signal, pulsing in a strange pattern that repeated every few seconds. The signal was coming from somewhere deep in this region of space, an area where no known civilization existed. Lisa pointed at the screen and explained that they had detected the signal about 20 minutes ago. It seemed to be a distress call of some kind, though the pattern was unlike anything in the database. Marcus studied the signal carefully. His years of technical experience gave him an instinct for patterns and problems. This signal did indeed look like a distress call, but it was different from standard human or even alien distress patterns. The frequency and rhythm suggested something very old, possibly ancient. More interesting, the signal seemed to be repeating a message that carried an enormous amount of data, far more than a normal emergency broadcast would need. "It could be a derelict station," Marcus said thoughtfully. "The power systems might be failing, causing the irregular pattern. If we move closer, I might be able to establish a proper connection and see what the signal is actually trying to tell us." Captain Lisa made the decision to investigate. The Aurora had been on a routine survey mission for 3 months, mapping a region of space that had never been thoroughly explored by humans. Finding a derelict station would be a significant discovery. Lisa ordered the helm to alter their course and increase speed toward the signal's origin point. For 3 hours, the Aurora traveled through empty space. Then a structure appeared on the visual screens. It was enormous. The station was at least 2 kilometers long, with a design that seemed to combine geometric shapes in ways that didn't quite match any architecture Marcus had ever seen. It was old, very old, but it was still emitting power. Lights flickered across its surface, and the distress signal was now much clearer. Captain Lisa assembled a small team to board the station and investigate. Marcus was included because his technical skills would be crucial to understanding the station's systems. The team also included Commander David, who was the ship's security officer, and 2 other crew members named Robert and Nina. They suited up in their spacesuits and prepared for the boarding operation. The airlock to the station was sealed, but not locked. This suggested whoever operated it had locked it down automatically, then abandoned their post long ago. Marcus used a portable computer terminal to hack the electronic lock. It took him only a few minutes. The system was ancient, but the basic logic was the same as any security system he had ever encountered. The airlock opened and the team entered. Inside, the station was cold and dark. The emergency lights provided minimal illumination, casting everything in a dim, eerie glow. The corridors stretched out in multiple directions, and the walls were covered in a strange material that seemed to absorb light. Marcus could hear his own breathing through the helmet comm system. They moved deeper into the station, following the strongest signal coming from their scanners. The structure of the station suggested it had been designed for beings much larger than humans. Doorways were enormous, corridors were massive, and everything had a feeling of incredible age. Finally, they came to a large chamber that contained numerous control stations and a massive central computer terminal. The distress signal was coming from this terminal. Marcus approached it carefully, scanning for any active defense systems or hazards. There were none. Whatever had protected this station long ago had powered down decades, perhaps centuries ago. Marcus connected his portable computer to the central terminal. Data began flowing into his system. His eyes widened as he read the information scrolling across his screen. This wasn't just any station. The data he was seeing was unlike anything in human knowledge. The technical specifications described a system far beyond human technology, a network of some kind that seemed to control vast amounts of computational power. "Captain, I am seeing something extraordinary," Marcus reported through the comm system. "This station seems to be some kind of hub for a larger network. The data signature suggests this was built by a civilization that made the most advanced beings we know about look primitive." As Marcus continued his investigation, alarms suddenly began blaring throughout the station. The displays lit up with warnings in languages he could not read, but the meaning was clear. Something in the system was failing catastrophically. The distress signal was not just a call for help from long ago. It was an active emergency alert, and whatever system this station was connected to was in crisis. Marcus realized he was looking at something that went far beyond human understanding, something that might have consequences affecting much more than just this one derelict station. He had started his day as a simple IT technician aboard a research vessel. Now he was staring at evidence of a cosmic crisis that he did not yet understand, but somehow knew he would have to help solve. The story of Marcus the IT specialist had just begun, and the fate of the universe would soon depend on his skills.